Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. Today I'm going to talk some about not blaming ourselves for things that aren't our fault. And this comes from When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Harold S. Kushner. And he writes about an experience that he had that he says taught him something about the ways in which people make a bad situation worse by blaming themselves. One January, I had to officiate at 2 funerals on successive days for 2 elderly women in my community. Both had died full of years, as the Bible would say. Both succumbed to the normal wearing out of the body after a long and full life. Their homes happened to be near each other, so I paid condolence calls on the 2 families on the same afternoon. At the first home, the son of the deceased woman said to me, "If only I had sent my mother to Florida and gotten her out of this cold and snow, she would be alive today. It's my fault she died." At the second home, the son of the other deceased woman said, "If only I hadn't insisted on my mother's going to Florida, she would be alive today. That long airplane ride, the abrupt change of climate was more than she could take. It's my fault she's dead." When things don't turn out as we would like them to, it is very tempting to assume that if we had done things differently, the story would have had a happier ending. This is something that a lot of us do, whether we're alcoholic, addict, or not. A lot of people in general tend to blame themselves when things go wrong around them. And we also tend to try to look to the past for ways that we could have prevented tragedies in our lives, tragedies in other people's lives. And we also like to look at what role that we played in those tragedies, even if we didn't really play a role. And I would argue that for alcoholics and addicts, sometimes our tendency to do this is more exaggerated than other people. And we tend to find ourselves at the center of tragedy more readily than other people might. And I would argue that probably the reason for that is that our sense of ego, our sense of pride, sometimes inflates our perception of our importance in the events that happen around us. And this might not sound comforting, but the reason that it's important to think about this is that a lot of times, for me especially, the stress and the anxiety that came from looking into the past and trying to figure out how my actions caused the tragedy and discomfort of people around me was when I had nothing to do with it, when I really had nothing to do with it, like the cases he mentions here. There were plenty cases where I did have something to do with bad things happening around me that I did need to go back and look at those things and re-examine my actions and figure out what I should have done differently. But there were lots of other times where I blame myself for things that happened around me that I really had nothing to do with. And that something bad happened just because sometimes bad things happen, and you can't blame yourself for them. So we've got to be careful in our programs of recovery not to carry this through, and it's important to recognize that sometimes bad things just happen, and it doesn't have to be that we caused them to happen. And like with anything in a program of recovery and in life in general, it's not black and white. So it's still important for us to work an honest fourth step, for example, when we're in a situation where we don't know whether we should have done something differently. It's important for us to look at a situation and honestly try to evaluate, what part did I play in this? But I think that in my active addiction, I was much more tempted to inflate my importance in the overall workings of the world, and to find fault with myself in situations where I really had very little to do with the outcome. And by finding that fault, it was a way of not only inflating my ego, because we inflate our egos even at the expense of our joy, even at the expense of our comfort. You know, we are the type of people who like to inflate our importance even when it means we have to suffer because of that. And we have to get away from that tendency. That's not a good place to be, and that's what contributed so much for me to the patterns of self-pity and depression and anxiety that I experienced during my extreme days of substance use. Was that, you know, I was at the center of every event that was happening around me, and if I was if I was at fault for something, you know, I felt I deserved to be punished by feeling bad about it. And that led to some vicious cycles of substance use and depression and anxiety that really were rooted in my desire to inflate my ego, get a nice big healthy ego, and really got to humble myself in recovery and be realistic about my role in the events in the world around me. So again, it's not black and white. It doesn't mean that I'm blameless for everything that happens in life. It doesn't mean that I shouldn't go back and look at what my role is and then do an honest review of whether or not I should have done anything differently. But we as people in recovery have to be very careful that we're not blaming ourselves for things that really we had nothing, if anything, to do with. That's the bit, you know, you can go back and in hindsight find something you should have said to somebody 20 years ago that if I had only said this to them, they'd be alive now. And we've got to be careful and avoid doing that, because that really only leads to grief. It doesn't bring anybody back, and it doesn't help resolve a situation that really probably, in all likelihood, had very little to do with us in the first place. That's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Have a good one.